It was a crisp Saturday morning in Maplewood Heights, the kind of day where everything seemed calm and perfect. The sun peeked through the trees, casting golden shadows on freshly cut lawns. Birds chirped cheerfully, and the neighborhood was quiet except for the occasional hum of a distant lawnmower. Chief Michael Reynolds stood on his porch, sipping coffee and enjoying the peaceful start to what he hoped would be a relaxing weekend. His wife, Sarah, was inside making breakfast, and their teenage son, Jake, was still sprawled out in bed, as teenagers often are on lazy weekends. Michael loved living in Maplewood Heights. It was a friendly community with tree-lined streets and well-kept homes. Sure, there were rules, lots of them, but most people followed them without much fuss. Things like keeping your trash cans hidden or painting your house colors approved by the Homeowners Association, HOA. Most residents didn't mind because it helped maintain the charm of the neighborhood. But today, something unusual caught Michael's eye as he stepped off his porch to grab the newspaper. Right in front of his driveway sat a bright orange traffic cone. At first glance, it looked almost comical, like someone had left it there as a prank. But then Michael noticed the piece of paper taped to the side of the cone. He picked it up and read the typed message. "Attention resident. You have been fined $79 for violation of HOA Rule number 427. Unapproved mailbox color. Immediate payment required. Failure to comply will result in further action." Michael blinked at the note, then looked at his mailbox. It was beige, a perfectly ordinary shade that matched nearly every other mailbox on the street. He couldn't believe what he was reading. A fine. For this, he scratched his head, wondering if this was some sort of mistake. Maybe they got the wrong house, or maybe someone was playing a joke on him. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't a prank. It was the work of the HOA. The HOA in Maplewood Heights had a reputation for being strict, almost obsessive, about enforcing its rules. They weren't exactly beloved by everyone in the neighborhood. Some residents whispered behind closed doors about how ridiculous some of the regulations were. One family had been fined for leaving a welcome mat outside their front door because it didn't match the approved color palette. Another neighbor received a warning for having wind chimes that made excessive noise. People joked about calling them the HOA cops because they acted more like enforcers than a group meant to improve the community. But none of that prepared Michael for what happened next. As he stared at the orange cone blocking his driveway, he felt a mix of disbelief and irritation bubbling up inside him. How could anyone think his mailbox was a problem? And why go to such extremes over $79? He glanced back at his car parked safely in the garage. If he needed to leave right now, he'd be stuck. The absurdity of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. What made it even funnier, or frustrating, depending on how you looked at it, was that these so-called enforcers had no idea who they were dealing with. Michael Reynolds wasn't just any resident of Maplewood Heights. He was the town's chief of police. He spent his days ensuring justice and fairness in the community, protecting people from real threats, not petty disputes over mailbox shades. Yet here he was, standing in his pajamas, staring at an orange cone placed by people who thought they were above common sense. For a moment, Michael considered letting it slide. After all, life was busy enough without adding drama over something so small. But as he crumpled the note in his hand, a spark of determination ignited within him. No one, not even the HOA, got away with bullying tactics, not on his watch. Little did they know, their little game of intimidation was about to take a turn they never saw coming. The Homeowners Association, HOA, in Maplewood Heights wasn't just your average neighborhood committee. To many residents, it felt more like a shadowy organization with an iron grip on every aspect of life within the community. At the center of it all was Patricia Whitmore, the chairperson of the HOA. She was a tall, stern woman in her late 50s with sharp features and an even sharper tongue. Her perfectly styled hair and designer blazers gave her an air of authority that made most people uneasy. Patricia took her role seriously, perhaps too seriously, and ran the HOA meetings like a military general leading troops into battle. Under her leadership, the HOA had created a thick handbook filled with rules so detailed that some residents joked it should come with a glossary. There were guidelines for everything: what color you could paint your front door, how high your grass could grow before it became a nuisance, and even restrictions on holiday decorations. If your Christmas lights stayed up past January 15th, you'd get a warning letter. Leave them up until February. That would cost you $50. It wasn't uncommon to hear stories of neighbors receiving fines for things as minor as leaving a garden hose coiled on the lawn or parking their car slightly over the curb line. Patricia's favorite phrase during HOA meetings was, "Rules exist for a reason." She said it often, usually while glaring at anyone who dared question her decisions, and while some residents appreciated the effort to keep the neighborhood looking pristine, others found the rules suffocating. One elderly man named Mr. Thompson once tried to argue against a fine for having a bird bath in his yard, claiming it brought joy to his grandchildren. Patricia responded by saying, "This isn't about joy, it's about compliance." The room fell silent after that, and no one challenged her again. What made matters worse was the way the HOA enforced these rules. They weren't shy about sending out notices, or enforcers, to remind people when they stepped out of line. These enforcers weren't actual police officers, but they carried themselves as if they were. Dressed in khaki uniforms with embroidered patches that read Community Compliance Officer, they drove around in white trucks plastered with the HOA logo. Some residents whispered that they acted like bullies, patrolling the streets and jotting down violations like schoolyard tattletales. When Michael first moved into Maplewood Heights, he thought the HOA seemed harmless enough. Sure, they were strict, but he figured it came with living in such a nice area. He never imagined he'd have to deal with them personally. But now, standing in his driveway staring at that orange cone, he realized just how far they were willing to go to enforce their rules. Blocking someone's driveway over a $79 fine. It was laughable, if it weren't happening to him. Michael decided to take action. On Monday morning, he called the HOA office, expecting a quick resolution. A cheerful voice answered, introducing herself as Linda from customer service. Michael explained the situation calmly, pointing out that his mailbox color had been approved years ago when he bought the house. Linda promised to look into it and get back to him shortly. Relieved, Michael hung up, thinking the issue would be resolved soon. But days passed, and there was no response. Instead, another envelope appeared in his mailbox, a second notice stating that failure to pay the fine would result in further enforcement actions. Michael shook his head in disbelief. This wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. It was becoming a test of wills. The HOA clearly didn't know who they were dealing with, or maybe they did, and they simply didn't care. Either way, Michael knew one thing for certain: this wasn't going to end quietly. As the week dragged on, Michael began noticing subtle changes in his interactions with neighbors. Some avoided eye contact altogether, perhaps afraid of being associated with someone labeled a rule breaker. Others offered sympathetic smiles, whispering words of encouragement whenever they saw him outside. It was strange how quickly the atmosphere shifted. What started as a minor inconvenience was turning into something much bigger, a clash between individual rights and collective control. And Michael couldn't help but wonder, where would it all lead? By Wednesday evening, Michael's patience was wearing thin. He had spent 2 days waiting for the HOA to respond to his calls and emails, but all he got in return were vague promises and automated replies. The second notice they sent, a sternly worded letter threatening further enforcement actions, only added fuel to the fire. It wasn't just the fine that bothered him anymore. It was the sheer audacity of the HOA to escalate the situation without even addressing his concerns. They weren't listening, and that made Michael more determined than ever to stand his ground. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Maplewood Heights, a white truck pulled up in front of Michael's house. 2 men stepped out, both dressed in khaki uniforms with the words Community Compliance Unit stitched onto their jackets. One was tall and broad-shouldered, while the other had a clipboard tucked under his arm like a weapon. They didn't knock on the door or announce themselves. Instead, they unloaded a large orange trailer from the back of the truck and parked it directly across Michael's driveway. Michael watched from his living room window, dumbfounded. Was this really happening? He opened the front door and walked outside, trying to keep his cool. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice calm but firm. "What exactly are you doing?" The taller man turned around, crossing his arms over his chest. "We're here on behalf of the HOA," he said matter-of-factly. "You've failed to comply with the fine, so we're taking further action." "Further action?" Michael repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You mean blocking my driveway with a trailer?" "That's correct," the man replied, unfazed. "Until the issue is resolved, your vehicle will remain immobilized." Michael couldn't believe what he was hearing. Immobilizing his car. Over a $79 fine. The absurdity of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. He glanced at the trailer, then back at the two men, who seemed completely unbothered by the ridiculousness of their actions. If anything, they looked proud, like they were enforcing some grand moral code instead of nitpicking about mailbox colors. For a moment, Michael considered arguing further. He wanted to point out how childish and petty this whole thing was, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the smirk on the shorter man's face as he jotted notes on his clipboard. Or maybe it was the realization that these guys had no idea who they were dealing with. Whatever it was, Michael decided to play along. For now. "Well, I hope you're comfortable," Michael said, crossing his arms and leaning against the porch railing. "Because this isn't going to be resolved anytime soon." The two men exchanged glances but didn't respond. They finished positioning the trailer, climbed back into their truck, and drove off without another word. As the sound of the engine faded into the distance, Michael stood there, shaking his head. This wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. It was about principle, about standing up to bullies who thought they could push people around because they wore uniforms and carried clipboards. Inside the house, Sarah peeked through the curtains, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Are they serious?" she asked, turning to Michael. "They actually blocked our driveway." "They sure did," Michael replied, still staring at the trailer. "But don't worry. They'll regret it." Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I just don't want this to turn into some big drama. Can't we just pay the fine and move on?" Michael hesitated. Part of him understood where she was coming from. Life was busy enough without adding unnecessary conflict. But another part of him, the part that had spent years protecting people from injustice, knew this wasn't right. Paying the fine would only validate their behavior, and Michael wasn't about to let that happen. As the night wore on, Michael found himself pacing the living room, replaying the events in his mind. Something about those two men, and the smug way they carried themselves, stuck with him. They acted like they were untouchable, like their authority couldn't be questioned. But Michael knew better. Everyone answered to someone eventually. And if the HOA thought they could intimidate him, they were about to learn a valuable lesson. You don't mess with a man who enforces the law for a living. Little did they know, the real drama was just beginning. The tension in the Reynolds household was palpable that evening. Michael sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through emails and documents on his laptop, trying to gather evidence to prove his mailbox color had been approved years ago. Sarah stood by the sink, drying dishes with more force than necessary. Her frustration was evident in the way she slammed each plate onto the counter. "Michael," she said finally, breaking the silence, "why can't you just pay the fine? It's only $79. Is it really worth all this trouble?" Michael looked up from his screen, his expression a mix of annoyance and determination. "It's not about the money, Sarah. It's about principle. If I give in now, what's stopping them from doing this again, or worse, to someone else who doesn't have the means to fight back?" Sarah sighed deeply, leaning against the counter. She knew her husband well enough to recognize that stubborn streak. Once he set his mind on something, there was no changing it. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was spiraling out of control. I get it, okay, but sometimes picking your battles is smarter than fighting every single one. What if this blows up into something bigger? You're chief of police, for heaven's sake. People are going to talk. Before Michael could respond, their teenage son, Jake, wandered into the kitchen, munching on a bag of chips. He'd overheard the conversation and decided to weigh in. "Mom, Dad's right," he said, plopping down on a chair beside his father. "They can't just block our driveway like we're criminals or something. That's messed up." Sarah shot him a look. "Stay out of this, Jake. This isn't some video game where you fight the bad guys. Real life has consequences." Jake shrugged, unfazed. "Yeah, but standing up to bullies is always the right thing to do. Isn't that what you guys taught me?" Michael grinned despite himself. His son had a point. Standing up to bullies, whether they wore uniforms or suits, was exactly what he did for a living. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She turned back to Michael, her tone softer but still firm. "I'm not saying don't stand up for yourself. I'm just asking you to think about how far you're willing to take this. Do you really want to drag our family into a neighborhood feud?" Michael leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He understood Sarah's concerns. Bringing attention to their personal lives wasn't ideal, especially since his role as chief of police already put them under a certain level of scrutiny. Yet he couldn't ignore the injustice unfolding right in front of him. The HOA's actions weren't just unreasonable, they were borderline tyrannical. Someone needed to call them out, and if it had to be him, so be it. As the argument continued, Jake chimed in again. "Why don't you tell them who you are? Maybe they'll back off if they know they're messing with the chief." Michael shook his head immediately. "No, that's not how this works. Using my position to intimidate people is wrong, even if they started it. Besides, revealing who I am might make things worse. They could accuse me of abusing my authority or turn this into a media circus." Sarah crossed her arms, looking skeptical. "And keeping quiet won't. Look, I trust you to handle this, but I don't want us caught in the middle of some ridiculous drama. Just promise me you'll think before you act." Michael nodded, appreciating her concern. "I will. I just need to figure out the best way to resolve this without losing my sanity or our dignity." Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Michael stayed up late, staring at the orange cone and trailer blocking his driveway. The streetlights cast eerie shadows across his yard, making the scene feel almost surreal. He thought about Sarah's words and Jake's enthusiasm, weighing the pros and cons of his next move. Deep down, he knew this wasn't just about a mailbox or a fine anymore. It was about sending a message. No one, not even the HOA, was above accountability. But as much as he wanted to teach them a lesson, he also realized that patience was key. Rushing into things could backfire, and he needed to choose his moment carefully. For now, the trailer remained in place, a symbol of the HOA's overreach, and while it frustrated him to no end, Michael couldn't help but smile faintly. Sometimes, the best way to win a battle was to let the other side dig their own hole first. The next morning, Michael woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent the night thinking about his options and decided it was time to take action, not just for himself, but for the entire neighborhood. If the HOA could treat him this way, what would stop them from targeting others? Someone needed to hold them accountable, and Michael was determined to be that person. As he stepped outside, coffee in hand, he noticed Mrs. Thompson, an elderly neighbor who lived 2 doors down, tending to her flower beds. She waved at him cheerfully, then hesitated when she saw the trailer still blocking his driveway. "Still there, huh?" she said, shaking her head. "Those folks sure don't mess around." Michael chuckled dryly. "No, they don't. But trust me, this isn't over yet." Mrs. Thompson gave him a knowing smile. "Good. About time someone stood up to them. If you need anything, backup, witnesses, or even baked goods. You let me know. Her words stuck with him throughout the day. It wasn't just him against the HOA. Plenty of neighbors were silently cheering him on. That realization gave him the push he needed to escalate things further. After breakfast, Michael gathered all the documentation he had: old emails approving his mailbox color, photos of similar mailboxes in the neighborhood, and copies of the HOA handbook highlighting vague language in their rules. Armed with evidence, he drafted a polite but firm letter addressed to Patricia Whitmore, demanding an immediate resolution. But before he could send it, something unexpected happened. Around noon, a black SUV pulled up in front of his house, followed by a news van emblazoned with the logo of a local television station. A reporter named Lisa Carter stepped out, microphone in hand, flanked by a cameraman. Michael watched in surprise as they approached his driveway. "Chief Reynolds?" Lisa asked, extending her hand. "I'm Lisa Carter from Channel 5 News. We received a tip about your situation with the HOA. Mind if we ask a few questions?" Michael blinked, caught off guard. "A tip? From whom?" Lisa smiled knowingly. "Let's just say someone thought your story deserved attention. Are you willing to talk?" For a moment, Michael hesitated. This wasn't part of his plan. But as he glanced at the orange cone and trailer, he realized this might actually work in his favor. Publicity could shine a light on the HOA's absurd behavior and force them to back down. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. "Sure, let's do it." The interview began with Lisa asking basic questions about the fine and the blocked driveway. Michael kept his tone calm and measured, explaining the situation clearly while avoiding any mention of his role as chief. He pointed out the ridiculousness of the HOA's actions, holding up documents to show how arbitrary their rules were. The cameras rolled as he stood beside the offending trailer, making his case with quiet confidence. Word spread quickly. By evening, social media was buzzing with screenshots of the news segment. Neighbors chimed in, sharing their own frustrations with the HOA. One woman posted a photo of her $25 fine for having a garden gnome deemed too whimsical. Another shared a story about being penalized for trimming hedges on a Sunday morning because it violated the noise ordinance. The comments section exploded with jokes about the HOA police and calls for reform. Meanwhile, inside the HOA office, panic set in. Patricia Whitmore watched the news segment unfold, her face turning pale. Calls poured in from angry residents questioning the organization's tactics. For the first time, the HOA found itself under public scrutiny. And they didn't like it one bit. Back at home, Michael sat on his porch, scrolling through the online reactions. Despite the stress of the past few days, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The tide was turning, and the HOA was finally facing consequences for their actions. Little did they know, this was only the beginning. The following Monday evening, Michael walked into the Maplewood Heights Community Center for the monthly HOA meeting. The room was already buzzing with tension. Residents packed the rows of folding chairs, many clutching copies of the news segment on their phones or notebooks, filled with grievances they'd been too afraid to voice before. At the front of the room sat Patricia Whitmore and the rest of the HOA board, looking unusually uneasy. Their usual air of authority had crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. Michael took a seat near the back, keeping a low profile for now. He wanted to see how this would play out before stepping in. As the meeting began, Patricia stood up, gripping the podium tightly. Her usual confident demeanor was replaced by nervous fidgeting as she cleared her throat. "Good evening, everyone," she started, her voice wavering slightly. "I understand there has been concern regarding recent enforcement actions. Let me assure you, the HOA is committed to maintaining the integrity of our community." Her words were cut short by murmurs rippling through the crowd. Someone shouted, "What about fairness?" Another chimed in, "Yeah, what about that mailbox fine? That's ridiculous." Patricia tried to regain control, but it was clear the residents weren't going to let her off easily. When the floor opened for comments, people lined up eagerly to speak. One man recounted how he'd been fined for planting marigolds in his yard because they weren't on the approved list of flowers. A young mother tearfully described receiving a warning for letting her kids draw chalk art on the driveway, a cherished weekend activity she thought harmless. Each story added fuel to the growing fire of discontent. Finally, it was Michael's turn. He approached the podium calmly, placing his folder of documents on the surface. For a moment, he simply looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his neighbors. Then, in a steady voice, he began. "My name is Michael Reynolds, and I'm here tonight, not just as a resident, but as someone who believes in justice and fairness." He paused, letting his words sink in. Patricia squirmed in her seat, sensing where this was headed. Michael continued, "I've been fined $79 for having an unapproved mailbox color, a color that, according to records, was approved when I moved in years ago. When I tried to resolve this issue peacefully, my attempts were ignored. Instead, my driveway was blocked with a trailer, a move so extreme it borders on harassment." Gasps echoed through the room as Michael held up photos of the orange cone and trailer. "This isn't just about me," he said firmly. "It's about accountability. It's about treating people with respect instead of bullying them into compliance. And if we don't address these issues now, things will only get worse." Patricia finally spoke up, her tone defensive. "Mr. Reynolds, the rules are in place for a reason. We can't make exceptions for everyone." "That's where you're wrong," Michael interrupted, his voice rising slightly but remaining controlled. "Rules should serve the community, not punish it. What you're doing isn't leadership. It's intimidation. And frankly, it needs to stop." For the first time, Patricia looked genuinely rattled. She glanced at her fellow board members, who shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tide turning against them. One of the members whispered something to Patricia, who reluctantly nodded. Clearing her throat, she addressed the crowd. Perhaps we need to revisit some of our policies to ensure they're applied fairly." The audience erupted in applause, but Michael wasn't done yet. Leaning closer to the microphone, he delivered his final blow. "By the way," he said casually, "for those who don't know me, I'm chief of police in this town. Obstructing someone's property without legal grounds isn't just bad manners. It's a misdemeanor offense. Something to keep in mind moving forward." The room fell silent, save for a few stunned whispers. Patricia's face turned bright red as she realized the gravity of the situation. By escalating the conflict, the HOA hadn't just picked a fight. They'd taken on the wrong person. And now, they had no choice but to back down. As Michael returned to his seat, the atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. Neighbors exchanged relieved smiles, knowing they'd witnessed a turning point. The HOA's reign of fear was over. For good. The fallout from the HOA meeting was swift and dramatic. By Tuesday morning, the story had exploded far beyond Maplewood Heights. Local newspapers ran headlines like "Chief of Police takes on overzealous HOA," and "Residents rally against neighborhood tyranny." Social media lit up with hashtags like #HOABullies and #JusticeForMichael as people across the country shared their own horror stories about overbearing homeowners associations. What started as a personal dispute in a quiet suburb had turned into a national conversation about fairness, power, and accountability. Patricia Whitmore and the HOA board found themselves drowning in backlash. Angry emails flooded their inbox, while phone calls poured in at all hours of the day. Some callers were polite but firm, demanding answers and reforms. Others were less restrained, accusing the HOA of being out of touch and tyrannical. Even local businesses began distancing themselves from the organization. 2 sponsors pulled out of an upcoming community event, citing concerns about associating with such controversy. Under mounting pressure, the HOA called an emergency session just 3 days after the disastrous meeting. This time, there were no residents present. It was strictly the board members huddled around a table, looking defeated. Patricia tried to defend her leadership, insisting that the rules were designed to protect property values and maintain order. But her arguments fell flat when another member pointed out that the recent chaos had done more damage to the neighborhood's reputation than any unapproved mailbox ever could. By the end of the session, the board agreed to sweeping changes. They promised to review every rule in the handbook, eliminating vague or overly restrictive policies. Fines would be capped at reasonable amounts, and enforcement actions would require approval from multiple board members instead of unilateral decisions by one person. Most importantly, they issued a public apology, not just to Michael, but to the entire community, for their heavy-handed tactics. For Michael, the victory felt bittersweet. On one hand, he was relieved to see tangible progress. The trailer blocking his driveway disappeared within hours of the emergency session, and the fine was officially rescinded. His neighbors greeted him warmly whenever they saw him, thanking him for standing up to the HOA. Some even joked that he should run for HOA president himself, a suggestion he politely declined. But on the other hand, Michael couldn't help but reflect on how much energy this ordeal had consumed. He thought about Sarah's initial reluctance to fight the battle and realized she'd been right about one thing. It wasn't easy dragging their family into the spotlight. Still, he knew it had been worth it. Watching the HOA scramble to regain trust reminded him why fairness mattered, not just in law enforcement, but in everyday life. One evening, as Michael sat on his porch watching the sunset, Mrs. Thompson stopped by with a plate of freshly baked cookies. "Just a little something to say thank you," she said with a warm smile. "You've done us all a favor, Chief." Michael accepted the gift graciously, laughing softly. "Well, I couldn't have done it without your tip to the news station. You played a big part in this too." Mrs. Thompson winked conspiratorially. "Let's just say I've been waiting years for someone to take them down a peg. Glad it was you." As the days passed, life in Maplewood Heights slowly returned to normal, or at least a new version of it. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now waved hello, emboldened by the knowledge that change was possible. Kids drew chalk masterpieces on driveways without fear of fines, and gardens bloomed with marigolds, daisies, and yes, even gnomes. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And while Michael hoped never to deal with the HOA again, he couldn't deny that the experience had taught him something valuable. Sometimes, standing up for what's right means taking on battles you didn't ask for. But if you approach them with patience, integrity, and a dash of humor, you might just inspire others to do the same. Weeks passed, and the chaos that once gripped Maplewood Heights began to fade into memory. The orange cone and trailer were long gone, replaced by Michael's car sitting safely in his driveway, a small but satisfying symbol of victory. Life in the neighborhood had shifted in subtle yet meaningful ways. Residents seemed lighter, less burdened by the constant fear of fines or reprimands. Conversations at the mailbox turned from cautious whispers about HOA rules to cheerful exchanges about weekend plans or gardening tips. For Michael, the ordeal left a lasting impression, not just on how he viewed his community, but on his role within it. As chief of police, he spent his days ensuring justice was served fairly and compassionately. But this experience reminded him that fairness wasn't limited to law enforcement. It mattered in every corner of life, even in something as seemingly trivial as a homeowners association. He realized that standing up against injustice didn't always require flashing lights or handcuffs. It could be as simple as refusing to back down when someone tried to push you around. Sarah noticed the change in him too. Gone was the frustration that had consumed him during those tense days. In its place was a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching Jake toss a football with friends across the street, she leaned over and said, "You know, I think this whole thing might have been good for you." Michael raised an eyebrow, amused. "Good? You mean getting my driveway blocked and being called a rule breaker?" She laughed softly. "No, not that part. But seeing how much it meant to everyone, you standing up to them, it reminded me why I fell in love with you in the first place. You're stubborn, sure, but it's because you care." Her words made him smile. It was true. He did care. And while he never sought out the spotlight, He couldn't deny the impact his actions had on the neighborhood. People who once felt powerless now felt empowered to speak up. Neighbors started attending HOA meetings regularly, asking questions and holding the board accountable. Slowly but surely, the culture of fear gave way to one of collaboration. Even Patricia Whitmore underwent a transformation, or at least as close to one as anyone thought possible. After resigning from her position as chairperson, she retreated from public view, leaving behind a leadership vacuum that prompted fresh faces to step forward. A new board emerged, led by a soft-spoken man named Greg Miller, who promised transparency and open communication. Under his guidance, the HOA became less about enforcement and more about fostering a sense of community. One Saturday morning, Michael received a letter in the mail. It was addressed to him personally, written in neat handwriting on plain stationery. Curious, he opened it and began to read. "Dear Chief Reynolds, I hope this note finds you well. I wanted to thank you for everything you've done, not just for me, but for all of us. Before your stand against the HOA, I never believed we could challenge their decisions. Your courage inspired me to speak up, and I know others feel the same. Thank you for reminding us that fairness matters, no matter where we are. Sincerely, Mrs. Thompson." Michael chuckled as he folded the letter and tucked it into his desk drawer. Mrs. Thompson had already thanked him with cookies, but this gesture touched him deeply. It wasn't just about solving his own problem. It was about creating ripples of change that reached far beyond his driveway. As time went on, the story of the HOA cops became a local legend. Parents told it to their kids as a lesson in standing up for what's right. Newcomers to Maplewood Heights heard it during welcome gatherings, often accompanied by laughter and nods of approval. Even Lisa Carter, the reporter who broke the story, followed up months later with a feature titled, "How One Man Changed a Neighborhood." Looking back, Michael knew the fight hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. He learned that sometimes the smallest battles reveal the biggest truths, that principles matter, that communities thrive when people work together, and that even the most ordinary moments can spark extraordinary change. And so, life in Maplewood Heights carried on, quieter and kinder than before. The absurdity of the mailbox fine faded into folklore, a reminder that even the strictest rules can't stand against determination, humor, and a little bit of heart.